Alrighty, we are recording. So if everybody's wondering what's going to happen, it is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto YouTube. Probably later today or potentially tomorrow. And then you'll be able to use whatever you need, whenever you need. Well, I am Tammy Pike, as it tells you there, from Santon campus. Those of you who've attended masterclasses before, you'll be familiar with me, but welcome now to our final one for the semester, and that is for your final exam. We're going to have a look first at a few of the rules. I estimate we're going to take about 3 hours. You obviously don't have to stick around for the whole time, but as we go, I'll fill you in more or less what we're going to cover in the first hour, the second hour, and then in the final hour. If we have lots of questions, it might take us a little bit longer, but I don't anticipate that it'll be much longer than 3. At a push, maybe 3.5. Looking at some of the basic rules that you will be familiar with the masterclass, you know your speak function has been deactivated, and that's just for muting purposes. Otherwise, it gets a bit chaotic. Please do use the chats. Remember, though, that I might miss your messages, but we'll always come back to them. And at the end of each section, so as I finish a section, what I will do is call for questions on that section or go over whatever questions were asked that I might have missed. And of course, it goes without saying, be respectful of each other in any communication. An idea of the format of the paper, you've probably been filled in on this already by your own lecturers. Our format did change last year, and we're looking now at the paper being out of 100 as opposed to 120 marks. Section A is usually made up of multiple choice questions and then potentially true falses. Section B is generally short theoretical questions, so 5 marks, 3 marks, 4 marks, depending upon how they've put them together. And then section C, students, will be for 40 marks in total. You have a choice of 2 questions out of 3, and each of them will be made up of questions coming to 20 marks. So please do make sure that you don't forget to answer 2. If you answer 3, we will mark the first 2. So if you decide you've answered 3 and you decide actually the second and the third one that you did were better, make sure you cross out that first one so that we don't mark it and give you a bad mark for that one. All right. So just being very clear which ones you're wanting us to mark. A few little tips, just because students often ask me, how should we study economics? Well, it's not only really economics, it's really all your modules that require this kind of approach, but economics particularly needs it. You'll see the first one says active learning methods, and that means that you need to be actively engaged. Pencil and paper, drawing, writing, mind maps, doing calculations. There is absolutely no ways you're going to pass economics with just trying to learn it. You have to actively engage with the material. And then the second point is that you've got to test yourself and as you're going through each section. And that doesn't just mean practice tests or practice exam papers. It means testing what you've just studied. Because if you've just gone through a section and you close that book and you then try and remember it and you can't, it's been a waste of time. Always, always, as you finish a section, test yourself on it. Do I remember enough of this to be able to go and face that closed book exam? So just a few tips, hopefully, that will help you. Now, for us today, you need a pencil and paper or a pen and paper, and you need to actively engage. If you're choosing not to, because you're just wanting to listen, then I would urge you to download the recording as soon as you can or go onto the recording as soon as you can and actively engage. Because each of these little activities that I've included in my presentation today are really to kind of help you get an idea of how you should be studying economics. And these are the kind of things that you should be doing for yourself as you work through the syllabus in preparation of that final exam. All right, so first thing, you need to be able to tell me. And my students are used to me asking this, but let's see how many others are able to do it. Can you list as many equilibriums correctly as you can that you've learned in PMIC already? I'm going to give you a minute to do that, and then we're going to have a look at all of them that you should be able to identify. So giving you a minute to do that. Alrighty, let's see what you did. Here they are. All of these are the equilibriums that we've studied in economics. Now, why are they so important? Because every single section that we study usually culminates in some sort of equilibrium. And therefore, if you, for example, understand your market equilibrium, well done, and Nathan, for getting some of them in there. If you understand each of these equilibriums correctly, you will then have the knowledge that goes into making each of them up, which then implies that you have actually studied your section relatively well. And then, of course, once you get to equilibrium, you always ask the question, what if? What if something changes? And of course, we are going to go through these, all of them today. What we're going to do is we're going to start with Learning Unit 7. We're going to work through to Learning Unit 10 because those you haven't been tested on before. And then, depending upon timing, we're going to go back over some of what you would have had to do for your Test 1 and then also your Test 2. And that's why I say you can stay as long as you need. If the first part is what you're particularly interested in, then I would estimate the first hour and a half, because I don't think we'll get through everything in 50 minutes for Learning Unit 7 through to 10, but then you can decide. And then the second section we'll do will be demand and supply, because obviously they're critical for the final exam. Then we'll do elasticities. Then we'll do Learning Unit 6, which is utility. And then finally, if there's time, we'll have a look at those first two learning units that you studied this semester. All right, there we go. Let's start with Learning Unit 7, Chapter 9. Now, I always like to break things down into easy bits. When you're studying, often you have to, what we almost call, chunk the information. So you put it into things that you can remember. What did I cover in this learning unit? And then what you do is you try and remember for each of those little sections, what was it that you had to cover? And the three key things that you covered in Learning Unit 7 were revenue, production, and costs. And that's what we're going to have a quick look at now. There's a lot of theory that falls in between what I'm going to show you on the slides. But remember, I can't help you much with theory. Theory you just have to study. But what I can help you to do is filling in the gaps or joining the dots. And that's what we'll be doing with this session today. There's, as I do usually with my master classes, I give you a whole bunch of questions potentially that can come from that section. Now, does that mean that these questions will come up? No, it doesn't at all, but they have come up in previous exams. And that's why I always give you a selection of questions that could potentially be there again. Over time, we tend to repeat some of the questions because there's obviously a limited amount of stuff that we want to check that you know. And what I always urge students to do is take a screenshot of this. Obviously, you will have access to this later, but you might want to have it now so that you can keep all of these screenshots of these questions on hand and make sure that you can answer them all. All of the information we cover now will basically answer these questions, but you will also have the resources. Every single question that you see in front of you here is answerable from the stuff you've studied or from the content you've studied. Nothing here is kind of outside of scope. Please make sure that you do understand each of the questions and then try and see as we go through the material now or the content now where we are answering each of those questions. And you can always just tick them off to say, yeah, we did actually work on that, or no, I need to go back and look at my stuff and see how I can answer that question. Here we go. Here's your first one. Distinguish between total, average, and marginal revenue. Nothing difficult, folks. 6 marks in the bag if you can simply do something like that. You're able to tell us what is total revenue, potentially give us the formula. The formula, you will have a formula sheet, so your formulas will be there, but that doesn't mean that in the context of a question like this, that we can't still award you a mark. What we're not going to do, though, is if it's asked you, for example, to distinguish between each of these, and you just give us the formula, we're not going to give you the marks, because then you haven't illustrated that you understand what we've asked. You need to obviously tell us what is total revenue, what is average revenue, and what is marginal revenue. And then just being comfortable with, do we know what is revenue as a whole? Remember, revenue is the turnover or the money you receive for your sales. If you're running a firm of any sort, be it a small little one-man business or be it a massive corporation, your revenue is going to be the income that you are receiving from the goods or services that you sell. As simple as that. Remembering that, or making sure that we know what do we mean by the basic term in each case. The second one, remember on that slide I showed you, was production. Now, production is critical. This is probably one of the most important concepts that you learn in first-year economics. And this relationship between total product, average product, and marginal product will be tested. It is almost always tested. If it's not in a multiple choice question or a true-false question, it potentially will be in a longer question. So please making sure that you do understand. We're going to take a moment now to just make sure that you've put together correctly what you should for each of these concepts. What is total product? It is the output that we are producing in our firm. But what is really important about what you're looking at in front of you now is that this is in the short run. Now, what is the difference between short run and long run in economics? Remember, the short run tells us that we have at least one input that is fixed. And usually that fixed input would be capital or land. Why do we say that? Because those are the two that are going to limit us. If you're a farmer, you've got a certain amount of land, for example, using nice, easy analogies that you can perhaps identify with. If you're a farmer, you've got a certain size farm. You are limited by that size farm in the short run. In the long run, you potentially can buy more land, or you could sell up and leave your farm completely. But in the short run, you are limited. The same goes if you are running a manufacturing operation out of a particular size factory or plant. That size will be fixed in the short run. And that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at the short run production function. And that tells us that the only way that we are able to increase our output is by increasing the units of our variable input. In other words, that input that we can change in the short run. And of course, the one most commonly used is labor, because that is the easiest one to change. We can simply hire people literally within hours, or we can reduce our workers in a matter of days. Perhaps a little bit more than that, depending upon contracts that we've entered into. But generally, the idea at this point is that we can hire and fire immediately. And that is why it is considered a variable input. What does this actually mean? It tells us that as we hire more and more labor, let me just grab my marker there. As we hire more and more units of labor, given the fixed size or capacity of our land or factory, we are able to increase the level of our output, initially at an increasing rate. We are then able to continue increasing our output at a decreasing rate. We will reach a maximum, and then our total product or our output will start to decrease. Now we've got to link that to your marginal product and your average product. So looking first at your marginal product is the addition to your total product when you hire one more worker. And what we notice here is that initially our marginal product increases, it reaches a maximum, and then it starts to decrease. What we need to now know about the relationship between TP and MP is that as long as marginal product is positive, total product will be increasing. As soon as marginal product reaches zero, you need to be able to tell me that total product is at a maximum. So when total product is at a maximum, we know now, that is a rule, marginal product will be zero. And then as marginal product becomes negative, so total product will start to decrease. And that, ladies and gents, is the basis for your law of diminishing marginal returns. And of course, that is essential, something you must be able to state, something you must be able to understand for this particular module. Then be able to look at your relationship between MP and AP. You'll notice as long as marginal product is greater than average product will be rising. As soon as marginal product is less than average product will be decreasing. And of course, knowing this graph will help you in theory and in actual application if you need to draw it. But please be sure that you are comfortable with it. As I say, frequently tested, and we want to be sure that students are able to give us an intelligible answer when we're marking. Production's not quite done yet because you've got some other information on production as well that we must look at. But before we go on, let's quickly ask anybody who can answer this question. Please tell me what the answer is. Yeah, well done. You listened. Just testing your listening skills or your knowledge, one or the other. Either you heard me say it or you knew it. Well done. That's one of our basic rules that we've got to absolutely be comfortable with. So well done. Thanks, students. Looking at completing tables. Now, you've got potentially 4 possible tables, 4 basic. There's actually 5 really, but there's 4 that generally are likely to come up. The first one is your Learning Unit 6 table, which you got in Test 2, which is your marginal utility and your total utility. The second one is your revenue, potentially your revenue table. So you can be asked to calculate total revenue, marginal revenue, average revenue. The third one is this one, which is your production calculations. The fourth one is your total costs, your fixed cost, your average cost, your variable costs. And then the last one is the one from labor chapter. So your marginal revenue product, calculating your marginal revenue product. You've got these 5. Now, generally speaking, at least one of them is tested in the exam. Every now and then they do leave them out completely, but on average, if we take the tests, the final exams for the last 5 or 6 years, there will usually be one of these tables. So you cannot go into that exam not being able to deal with your tables. The advantage of it as well is that they're super easy marks. If you've practiced them and you can get them correct, you can get those marks really easily. Let's have a bash and see. I'd just like you to try for yourselves. You're welcome to put it into the chat line as well. I'd like you to just go and see, are you able to tell me what is the value of A? Just checking to see who's able to at least get started, or if there are some of you that are able to. And if you find you don't know, then just put a question mark. So then I also get an idea of students not being completely comfortable with what the answer should be. Yes, yes, absolutely, Vic. We will get the formula sheet in the exam. So you will have the formulas there, which will help you a lot. There we go. So I've got at least 2 that are unsure, and then I've got at least 2 that you are absolutely correct. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through the table quickly, and we're just going to show you what they would be, what the answers would be. Notice that your formulas are at the top there. I have given them to you above the table, making sure that you would be able to do the calculations, and then just checking that you conceptually understand. Obviously, we're not in the teaching phase now because we're just in the presentation phase. Watch out, can you do this? But I'm going to give you a little bit of a few tips as to how to be able to approach this. Also to all students, even if you have practiced your tables and you're feeling fairly confident, be prepared that when you see a table in the exam, your first initial feeling may be one of confusion. You'll either be super happy because you've got this and you know it straight away, or you will feel that momentary confusion. Don't panic, it's perfectly normal. What you do is just orientate yourself, go check your formula sheet. Can you pick up your formulas and then get started on doing the calculations? Looking at what you should be able to do here, the first thing would be to go in and complete for 1 unit of labor. We see that when I hire one worker, he or she is able to produce 16 units total output. Total output of one worker, 16 units. What does that mean for average product? Well, if we simply apply the formula, that's total product divided by the units of labor. So you're just applying your formula there. That'll be 16 divided by 1. And then we go to our marginal product. What was the addition to total by that one worker that I hired? And you should be able to see that that is 16 as well. Quite easy, you should be able to fill in that information. Then we go to A. What is A now? It's asking us the total product. Well, if you know that you've hired 2 workers and each worker on average is able to produce 18 units, you should then, from a numerical perspective, be able to work out that the total produced by the 2 workers will simply be 2 times 18. Now, if you can't, this is not economics that is causing you a headache. This is numeracy that is causing you a headache. And then you want to just learn how to apply this information. And you can do it by learning it. And then your numeracy skills will start to kick in. After they've had a bit of practice, you'll find that they will start to kick in. There we have A is 36, which is 18 times 2. And then we want to just do one last one before I show you the solutions, is your marginal product for your second worker. In other words, what was it that your second worker added to your total output? Well, it was simply the difference between those two. I increased my workers by 1, my delta change in N, therefore my delta N, the change in the number of workers was 1, and I'm going to be dividing by 1. I can then look at what was my change in total product, 36 minus 16, and that gives me easily the answer that I need for my marginal product. There's a little bit of an introduction for you folks. Just please make sure you can practice the same table over and over and over again, just making sure that you are comfortable with it. Here's all your answers. If you want to just take a snapshot of it, and then you know you can go and practice this little table and being comfortable with being able to do the calculations. Also, just be aware that once you've learned this and you know the methodology, what methods you are using to do the calculations, you could get a question like this in a linear format. They don't have to put it into a tabular format. In other words, they could put it into what we call a number sum or a word sum. And they could give you the information, and you've got to pull out the relevant information to be able to calculate marginal product and average product. Generally, I find that if students have practiced this enough times and they're comfortable with it, they're easily able then to apply that knowledge in a different format. Production, I think, is done. Yep, and now we will move on to cost concepts. We'll stop at the end of this learning unit if there's anybody that's got any particular questions, but let's now get to the end of the cost concepts, and then we'll see, can you do those tables as well? There's a lot of theory relating to your cost concepts, folks. You've got to be able to describe a fixed cost. You must be able to give an accurate example of fixed cost, of variable cost. Remember, your fixed is what doesn't change no matter what you produce. In other words, even if you produce nothing, you will still have a fixed cost. Let's give you a real live example. Any of you sitting in your Emirates building, not now necessarily, but when you're sitting in there for your lectures, that building is a fixed cost. Whether we had no students or 1,000 students, we've still got that cost. What is your variable cost? Your variable cost is the cost of running that organization with all your students. So as we get our students coming in there, how much electricity do we work? How do we need? How many desks? How many chairs do we need? That could also be fixed in a way, but that's going to vary depending upon how many students we have. So making sure that you're clear in your mind, what do we mean by a fixed cost and what do we mean by a variable cost? Then you've got another two types of costs to distinguish between, and that is explicit and implicit. Please make sure explicit equates with expenses. What you learn in accounting as expenses, that's explicit. Whereas implicit are those costs of something that will not necessarily be paid out, but is nevertheless taken into account from an economics perspective. And remember that in economics, what we do is we take these two together and we call those two together economic costs. And that takes us to the last point that I've put on the screen, and that is distinguish between accounting costs and economic costs. Accounting costs are only explicit. Explicit costs are simply accounting costs. So when we are doing it from an accountant's perspective, we are just looking at explicit costs. If we are looking at it from an economics perspective, then we are taking into account both explicit and implicit, and we call those economic costs. Theory, folks, theory needs to be learned. Obviously, I need you to understand it as well, because that obviously helps you then with the application of some of the other questions that we need to ask you. Case in point, we come to costs in the short run. Now, you need to understand the difference between short run and long run, and you need to understand the difference between fixed and variable inputs, because that is going to impact on the costs. And that is why we now have total fixed costs and we have total variable costs. And then we have average fixed cost and we have average variable cost. You can understand perhaps that if you didn't grasp some of the earlier information that we've done in this learning unit, when you get to this part, it doesn't really come together because you haven't understood what do we mean by these fixed and variable. But once you've grasped that, then this should be pretty clear to you. And here we start again with formulas. Remember, please, that this is not just formulas. You will have the formula sheet. Those formulas will be there, but we need you to be able to describe each of them. Even though we focus now for a moment on the formulas because we want to make sure you can apply them, when you go into that exam, you need to be able to give a brief description of each of these costs as well, both total costs and unit costs. And here comes our first little story that we've got to be familiar with, and that is that total cost in any organization will be equal to total fixed cost plus total variable cost. Kind of obvious if you're thinking like a business person. The cost to Emirates is the cost of that whole building plus all of their variable costs. And that is going to give them their total cost structure. And then, of course, what we call here is our unit costs. All of these together are our unit costs. You need to be able to calculate them, you need to be able to describe them, and then you need to be able to apply them depending upon the question that is being asked. Here's your table for your costs. Once again, I'm going to ask now if anybody is able to give me the answer for 20. Give me the answer for 20. Give me the answer for, let's start with what I always like to start with when you're doing this kind of table, and this was taken from a previous exam paper, is I always like to start with a total fixed cost, and that is because it is constant. Remember, total fixed cost stays the same. I would therefore like to ask you folks, can anybody tell me what is the value of B? Okay, I'm just going back, Mohadi. I'll go back one just for a moment. There you go. All right, back to where we were. There we go. All right, looking for the value of B. Just waiting a minute or two to see if anyone can give it to me. All right, I'm going to assume at this point that you're all battling a little bit. We've taught you a few times. Ah, well done, Nathan. Ah, there we go, Latavo. Well done. We've got some of you coming through correctly. You are correct. It is 60. What will happen when you get a situation like this? I think most of you will be used to looking for fixed cost when the units produced are naught, because most of our tables that we do with you start with a zero. And of course, if we have a total cost when we produce nothing, then that cost is our fixed cost. But in this case, you don't have zero. The problem is then what do you do? I always say if you haven't got zero, then go to your averages, check your averages. What averages have you got that will potentially help you? Now you've got an average here under average fixed cost. You haven't got any average variables. You've got some average totals. Sorry, my mouse was giving a bit of trouble there. You've got some average totals, but that's not going to help you at this point. Your thing that is going to help you most, or your information that is going to help you most, is that average fixed cost. Because what do we know about average fixed cost? Well, if our average fixed cost for 4 units of output is 15, then our total fixed cost for 4 units of output must be 15 times 4. Now, once again, that's not economics, that's numeracy. If you're battling with that, it probably is because you don't understand your formulas correctly. Go in and practice using your formulas a few times, and eventually you will be able to work it out. B would be 60. And of course, once you've got 60 for B, then you're able to go and put in 60 in all of your or rows. So you can go down and you can say 60 all the way down, because that's what we know about total fixed cost. We know that it's not going to change. It's going to stay the same all the way through. And this gives us a little bit of a base to start working with. Once again, I'm not going to do the whole thing with you. I'm going to show you the answers in a moment. But I want to just do one or two more just to get you comfortable with what you're actually doing. Once you've got this information, we can at least now go to units 1 when we produce 1 unit of output, whatever this product is, and we are able now to go in and work out our total cost, because remember, total cost is equal to total variable cost plus total fixed cost. So we can go in and say 60 plus 25, and this is going to give us 85. And that's an easy one to fill in. From here, your average total cost, your average variable cost, and your average fixed cost should be relatively easy to do. It's simple, straight application of your formulas, making sure that you can do and apply your formulas. Your challenging one, again, is going to be your marginal cost. And your marginal cost in this particular case is going to be the difference between the total cost when you produce nothing and when you produce 1 unit. Now, remember, your total cost when you produced nothing was your total fixed cost. So effectively, it will be the difference between 60 and 85, which is going to be your 25. So just making sure that you are able to do those little tricky ones. Oops, sorry about the number there. You need to be able to calculate your marginal cost. That is always going to be your troublesome one. Then we're going to quickly do A, because A is also a problem for many students. And A is your total cost when you produce 2 units. Now, we don't have averages. We don't have variable cost, total variable cost here. So now how do we get our total? Now we go back to our theory. What does our theory tell us? It tells us that my marginal cost is my addition to total cost when I produce 1 more unit. I go back to my total cost for 1 unit, and I say when I produce 1 more unit, which is now 2 units, what do I add to my total cost? And I add 20. So 85 plus 20 is going to give me, if I've done my sums right, it's going to give me 105. And that takes me on my way. So pretty much now you should be on your way, and then you should be able to work all of these out. Once again, folks, I urge you to practice it. It is really frustrating. In the one exam, the 1 year, they gave 2 marks for each of these calculations. Usually it's only 5 marks, but they gave 2 marks, which was 10 marks. 10% in the final exam, that's quite a lot of marks, and you don't want to lose them unnecessarily. What should it look like when it's done? Pretty much like that. Once again, take any tables that you've got and just make sure you're able to calculate them. Go through it, do it 3 or 4 times, and then you should be good to go. Sometimes, just as a warning, sometimes what they do, which makes it quite a challenge, is they leave out these 2 columns. And you're just stuck with all of your total cost and then your unit costs. And what happens is students get super confused. What I would suggest that you do is, if they do that, just add the columns on at the end, add on those columns at the end and put them in. Still calculate your total variable cost, calculate your total fixed cost, and that will help you then to not make silly mistakes. Some students can cope fine with that because they do their calculations outside and they know what they're doing, but a lot of students get super confused when all the columns aren't there. And then the other thing I must warn you about is being really careful that you're in the right column. Often they change the order of the columns, and then you easily make a mistake going to the wrong column when you're doing a calculation. But those are little things which you just need to be aware of in that exam. And then NB, NB, NB. Can you draw and explain your unit costs? Now, just going back again quickly to our previous slide, this is all your unit costs. All of those are unit costs. And if they're asking you to draw a graph, they're asking you to draw a graph that represents these costs. Now, they're not going to ask you to plot. So they're not going to ask you to calculate and then to plot. What they're going to do is ask you to conceptualize. What should they look like? And of course, this is super important. Those of you who've been able to understand and work on Learning Unit 8 and Learning Unit 9 will understand that these cost curves are critical because we take them through and we use them in Learning Unit 8 and in Learning Unit 9. And of course, then they can ask you a 10-mark question, draw and explain what the unit cost curves look like. Please make sure you can do it. Let's have a look. First one, short run costs. Remember, it's a short run because we've got fixed and variable. There comes our first one, average fixed cost. The shape of these curves is specific. You can't alter the shape. They must look as they look on the screen here in front of you. The intersection here is not critical. That's not critical, and the starting point there is not critical, but the shape of the curve and the positioning of it above your AFC is critical. And that is your average variable cost. Then comes your average total cost, which can be AC or ATC. Remember, we've got the 2 ways of naming that curve. And then comes your really important one, which is absolutely critical for Learning Unit 8 and Learning Unit 9, and that is your MC curve. I refer to it as a Nike tick. That was kind favor of one of our developers who always referred to it as a Nike tick, and said that you must remember that it looks different to your other U-shaped. It is still U-shaped, but it's got a much steeper U than your AC or your AVC. The other important thing, folks, is that it must intersect your average cost curve and your average variable cost curves at their minimum points. If you go in and you put in something like this, MC, we are not going to give you the mark for that MC because you have not correctly placed it. Please note that it must be correctly placed, otherwise you will not be able to get that mark. All right, let's see. There we go. I can get rid of it. There is your completed graph, making sure you can tell us what each of those represent in words, and then you can also label them correctly in your graph. I can't stress, ladies and gents, how important this is. And once again, not just because it might be a question in the exam, but because it helps you to understand what is going to happen in Learning Unit 8 and Learning Unit 9. That was the end of Learning Unit 7. Anybody got anything that they want to query or ask, or that I didn't cover that you want to see whether it's significant or not? Giving you a moment or two to respond. All righty. On to Learning Unit 8 and Learning Unit 9, which we do as one, because this is market structures, and essentially you must be able to describe, identify, compare all of your market structures. I'm going to summarize this section, obviously, and then we'll have a look at the application. Just let me check Mark's query. Between short run and long run, which one is more common in the exam? Well done, Mark. Short run is the most commonly questioned, all right? So most of our questions that we set are in the short run. Having said that, there's one particular one which does take into account the long run, and that is in Learning Unit 8 and Learning Unit 9, when we're looking at the different market structures and comparing them. We then need to be able to compare in the long run. But the most commonly asked is definitely short run. Some questions for Learning Unit 8 and Learning Unit 9. Letting you take a look at them quickly. Some sneaky questions in there, I must tell you. Things that you may not have paid attention to, be careful. The question 4 and 5 are pretty predictable questions, whereas question 1, 2, and 3, a little bit less predictable, and potentially could be what I call the sneaky questions. They're really testing, have you studied your theory or your content well and in full? Looking at your identification of your market structures and what we call the market structure spectrum. Bearing in mind that you've got perfect competition at the one end and pure monopoly at the other end. What is it that makes these the two extremes is the number of firms that are operational and the entry and exit into the market. For perfect competition, there are many small firms. No one can influence the price. Whereas for pure monopoly, you've got a single supplier who is able to influence the price. They don't have total control over price, but they have a significant amount of control over the price. And then the other big difference between them is your perfectly competitive market structure. There is freedom of entry and exit into and out of the market, whereas in your monopoly, entry into that market is blocked. That's what makes it essentially a monopoly, is not just that there's one firm, but that entry into the market is blocked. Your two extremes, just to give you an idea of what it looks like, and then your two in between, monopolistic competition and oligopoly. I stress for my students, please, that you need to know what we mean by market power. Perfect competition has no market power. In other words, they are unable to influence the price of the product, whereas all three of the others have some influence on the price. Monopolistic competition has a little, oligopoly has more, and pure monopoly has the most amount of influence on their price. And then students, I can't urge you enough. You cannot answer questions on these market structures if you don't know what they all look like. And that's why I urge you all to study this table, 10-1, which is in your textbook. Make sure you really know it well. It honestly does give you a very clear picture of each of your market structures. It also allows you to answer most of the questions, certainly the short questions that they ask. And then they can ask you questions just to compare based on the characteristics of the different market structures. Just compare them. What do they look like? What is similar about them? What is different? So it's a bit blurry on the screen. That doesn't matter because we don't need to look at it now. I just wanted to have it in front of you to remind you that it is really, really so important to know this well. A lot of students come to me when they're struggling with these sections, both Learning Unit 8 and Learning Unit 9, and often they haven't clearly identified in their mind what does a perfect competition market structure look like, or what does monopolistic competition look like. Once you've got a clear picture in your mind, you're then much more easily able to answer questions that relate to any of these market structures. The only information that isn't really covered in this table is if you're doing a comparison, say, for example, between perfect competition and any of the imperfect, so it could be any one, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, or monopoly, is that perfect competition will always have a lower price and a greater quantity. Please bear that in mind. It's one of the important differences that you see between perfect competition and imperfect competition. And then efficient and inefficient. Perfectly competitive firms are usually considered efficient, and that is because in the long run, they will produce at the lowest point on their average cost curve. Whereas your imperfectly competitive firms generally do not produce at the lowest point on their average cost curve and therefore are considered inefficient. Be careful, because in the past they have asked us in an exam to simply describe what do we mean by efficient or inefficient in the context of market structures, and that's what they would be referring to. Just checking the time because it's almost time to go on our first break. Students, when you study Learning Unit 8, which is Chapter 10, you're first introduced to all the market structures, which is what I've just shown you now. And then what you are introduced to is the rules, the strict rules that apply to all market structures. And these rules are what we use to answer the two questions. And that is it worth staying in business? And if it is worth staying in business, how much should we produce? Please, these rules, once again, are super important. Again, because they can be asked, they can be tested in the exam as the specific rules, or they must be applied in all of the application for market structures. Particularly one of these rules. The shutdown rule, we don't apply quite as often as we do the profit maximizing rule. Folks, make sure you know them. Make sure you can describe them, and make sure you can apply them. They will be there in some or other format. They always are in every single exam, even if it is in just one of your longer application questions. And then I introduce you to what I call the profit rules. It's not what appears in the textbook, and it may not be what your lecturers have told you, but what I try and distinguish between is the shutdown rule, the profit maximizing rule, and then what are the profit rules, which tells us how much profit we're making. Be careful, obviously, if they're asking you for the profit maximizing rule, you mustn't confuse it with the profit rules. But that's exactly why I put them together. I need you to identify the differences between them. And what are profit rules? That is whether we're making economic profit, normal profit, or an economic loss. And pretty much if you know all of these, then a lot of the other stuff that we ask you on in this section tends to come together, because you realize, I'm just applying this rule, and you should be able to do it quite adequately. All your market structures, a summary of what you need to know for all market structures. Requirements, conditions, features, characteristics, all the same thing. All right. Whatever we're asking you, what are the requirements for perfect competition? What are the requirements for monopoly? What are the requirements for monopolistic competition? All of that is exactly the same. Conditions, features, characteristics. In other words, what does it look like? Are you able to tell me what each of these look like? And therefore, how do we identify the market structure that a firm is operating inside of? Now, this is important information also for you from a business perspective. When you're in a company one day, you're going to need to know what sort of microenvironment you're actually operating in and be able to identify each of them. And then making sure that you can give examples of each as well. I'll show you just now. Please, do you all know what we mean by price takers? Price takers mean that it's perfect competition. They have to accept the price that is determined in the market through the forces of demand and supply, and they take the price as given, whereas a price maker is able to influence their price. They have some control over their price. Therefore, price takers refer only to perfect competition. So remember, that's only perfect competition, whereas price makers is all of your imperfect competition. All of your imperfectly competitive market structures are all price makers, because they have some control over their price. And then, as I said to you, being able to give an example of each, a correct example. Don't go guessing, rather learn and make sure that you've got a correct example for each of those different market structures. We're going to go take a short break now, and then what we'll come back is look at the graphs for all of these market structures. I think we're reasonably on time. I'm a little bit behind, maybe about 3 slides behind, but on average, I think we're on time. You are welcome to all take a break now. I will be on hand, though, to answer any questions. So if you've got any questions that you want to ask now, you're welcome to do that. Alrighty, folks, let's have a look at these graphs for all the market structures. What might be quite a nice idea for you now is, if you are still struggling with any of these graphs, is to try and draw them along with me step by step. The problem is often you studying these graphs from already completed pictures, and that makes it difficult for you to tell the story. Whereas if you do it now step by step, as we do, not all of them, but some of them I've done step by step, you may find that you can then talk yourself through them. That's the way to learn graphs, is not to try and learn the completed graph off by heart, but rather draw it from scratch. So from the axes, and then step by step through the graph and talk yourself through it. That's one of the best ways to be able to, one, memorize it, and also to be able to understand it. Let's take a look. I'm going to ask you a few questions first on a graph. This was very similar to a question that appeared in a previous exam. I'm going to ask some additional questions as well, but let's have a look at it first, and please pop into the chat line, if you can, the answer to question number 1. Which market structure is represented by this graph? Absolutely. Well done, Nathan. You are correct. It is perfect competition. And of course, how do we know that it's perfect competition? Because we can see that the demand curve is a straight line. And that is because they are price takers and they have to charge the price that is determined in the market. The other thing that we also know is that at this point here, MR is equal to AR. So important for you in a question to possibly do this on your question paper, reminding yourself that MR is equal to AR. Sorry, I just want to fix that. So making sure that it keeps there. Oh, goodness gracious, it refuses to recognize. There we go. Equals, and then AR. Always putting it in and making sure that what you've done is you've done it so that you recognize where is MR, where is AR, and of course here we have price. So now we know that price is equal to MR is equal to AR, and that reminds us. Yeah, sorry, Sandra. Yeah, give it a moment or two, or it might be your connection on your side. All right, so that was the answer for question number 1, which market structure is perfect competition? Then what is the firm's profit maximizing daily output? What are we doing now? We're simply applying our rule. So can anybody please tell me how much is this firm going to produce per day? Just waiting to see if anyone can tell me. So, no, we're not going to produce 120. We'll talk more about it in a minute. Let's just see if anybody else has got anything else for me. Good try, though, but an important mistake that you've made that we must fix. All right, so 60, nope. So, folks, do you see now? This is where the rules become so important, because what was the profit, or what is the profit maximizing rule? Remember, your profit maximizing rule is that you will produce where MR is equal to MC. So NB, I'm going to put it in the chat line here as an NB for you all to remember. Profit maximizing rule is also known as our output rule. Tells us MR is equal to MC. And once we're able to apply that rule, this becomes obvious, because where is MR equal to MC? We can see that it has to be there. That means that the quantity that will be produced is going to be 100. Do you see how easy it is? And that's why those rules are so important. Please, if you were struggling with this because you didn't know which one to choose, it's because you don't know those rules. You know those rules, this becomes super straightforward. And then, of course, what is the total daily revenue of the profit maximizing firm? Once you know what the quantity is, then to calculate the revenue is super easy, because it's just TR, which is equal to price times quantity. We know that our quantity is 100 and we know that our price is 9, and therefore our total revenue for this firm per day is 900 Rand. So super easy to be able to calculate. But you see how it all boiled down to understanding that profit maximizing rule. Can't stress it enough. And then we go to point number 4. This is now a tricky question. What is the marginal revenue of the firm if it decides to produce only 55 units? Now, once again, your theory's got to kick in. Because what do we know about marginal revenue? Well, marginal revenue is equal to price, and as long as that price does not change, the marginal revenue will not change. Therefore, if we decide to go and produce at this position, it's not a very smart decision, because why would we do that? It's not rational. But if we did, for whatever reason, maybe we've been forced into that situation for some reason, our marginal revenue is still 9. So you still have to be able to go back to your price, because that is what is equal to your marginal revenue. Well done, Nathan. It would remain at 9. Absolutely. So these are some of the questions you need to be able to ask. The other question that we could ask you here is, how do we know this is the short run? Now, this boils down to that little table that I showed you at the beginning, because we would be able to tell that this is the short run because this firm, at their profit maximizing quantity, which is 100, is making economic profit, because this is where our profit is. Now, these are the things I'm going to help you with now when we look at the graphs, but this is what you've got to be able to do. Good test for you before you go into the final exam. If you can't read this graph, you're in trouble because you don't know your work well enough. If you can read this graph and you can answer all these kind of questions, then you know that at least you're on the right track. You've got a chance of being able to answer questions that they ask you in that final exam. Once again, just a short run. That was one of the questions. I'm just trying to think if there was any other question that you needed to ask. Oh, that would be, what type of profit are we making? And in this particular case, according to our profit rules, average revenue is greater than average cost, because there's my average cost, there's my average revenue. So as long as average revenue is greater than average cost, 9 is greater than 6, then I'm making economic profit. Remember, that is AR is greater than AC. That implies economic profit. Once again, those rules will help you to answer most of these questions. There's some of your answers to these 4 questions, or the answers to these 4 questions that I've just asked. All right. Another tricky question that you can get in the final exam related to these same concepts is that profit maximizing rule. In other words, it says, show with the aid of a graph where a perfectly competitive firm's profit is maximized. And this is the graph from the textbook. The graph itself is super easy. You've just got these 2 straight lines. The one is your MR line, which is the same as your price, remember, which is the same as your average revenue. And then you've got your MC line, which in this case is an odd looking MC curve because they've just done it as a straight line, but don't worry about that. You wouldn't normally draw it as a straight line, but that's how the textbook has represented it, based on the information that they gave you in that table, which was in the textbook as well. What is important here, though, folks, is being able to explain what the situation is when we are not at equilibrium. In other words, we are not at our profit maximizing position. What does it mean? Well, first of all, if we're here marginal revenue is greater, marginal revenue 10 is greater than marginal cost, it pays us as a firm to increase our output. And that's what you've got to be able to tell us. We should be increasing our output. If, however, we're in this portion of the graph, our marginal revenue is less than our marginal cost, it pays us to decrease our output. And why is this the case? Because we know that the best possible position we can be in is the profit maximizing position or loss minimizing position, which is where MR is equal to MC. Marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. NB. Make sure you're comfortable with that. And then we go on to drawing our actual graphs. Now, your questions that you saw on the first slide there would have said something along the lines of explain with the aid of a graph the short-run equilibrium of a firm under perfect competition, making whichever profit they want you to show. You've got to be able to do all three. There are three possible short-run equilibrium positions for any firm, and you need to be able to illustrate this situation. Now, I said to you, I'm going to give you the tips in terms of working with me on a graph. And this is how you want to approach it when you are studying your graphs in preparation for the exam. First thing is your axes, drawing, which you all can do, and then labeling them. Now, the textbook labels P and Q, price and quantity, which I don't altogether support in terms of the price, because by rights, this little price here is not just price. It is actually unit revenue and cost. But the textbook does it like this, so therefore we accept it. So it's usually price per unit. So I would urge you to rather do it in full. Look, we're not going to be that tough on you if you do. You may lose a half a mark if you've just put P and Q, but I would prefer if you try to do it correctly. The next step, always, no matter which market structure you are working with, the next step is you want to go in and put in, I'm just looking at here, Joshua, hi. Thanks, Josh. Josh has put in some of the rules that we actually work when we are going through this. Brilliant. So he's put them all in there for you, which gives you a good a rundown. We've already looked at a summarized version of the rules, but there he's able to give you that and tell you a little bit about what we're doing now as well. Looking at the graph, so step by step, we've got the axes. Next thing is always, folks, always, no matter which market structure you're working with, demand curve. In this case, it's perfect competition. Therefore, we've got a straight line demand curve. And we know straight away, we put in all that information. Price is the same as marginal revenue, which is the same as average revenue, which is in effect our demand curve. Your next step that you always do when you are drawing any of these graphs is you go for your profit maximizing position. And that will be your MC curve. There comes our MC curve. Remember, we make it like a Nike tick. We put it through our MR line or our demand curve, and then we identify where is MR equal to MC. Once we've identified where MR is equal to MC, that gives us the quantity that we will produce. And you can see here, we're applying those rules, and that is why they are so critical. We're ignoring the shutdown rule. Not to say that you'll never have to apply the shutdown rule. You may well, so you must learn it. But in the context of this particular graph that we're doing, we're not worrying about shutdown because this firm is in business. We don't have to ask the question, is it worth staying in business? We've got our profit maximizing position, MR is equal to MC, and then you ask yourself, what do I want to show? What is the question asked us? Is it asking us for economic profit? Is it asking us for normal profit? Or is it asking us for economic loss? Well, in this case, you'll see at the top here, I've said normal profit, or more correctly, zero economic profit. That means that I've got to show the situation where average revenue is equal to average cost. And what that means is that my AC curve will sit on my demand curve. And there you have it. And remember this little rule here, that your marginal cost curve must intersect the AC curve at its minimum point. You don't do that, we're going to have to penalize you, all right? So once again, making sure that you've applied all of those rules, which are critical when you are drawing your graphs. And then you just tell us what you've done. You tell us exactly as the story went what is actually going on. And that is why I say it's so important for you to learn your graphs like this. So you learn them step by step, and that helps you then to know what you're actually doing, understand the graph, apply the rules because you're having to apply the rules, and then also being able to explain it adequately for your explanation. All right, so now what would you do if you had to show economic profit or an economic loss? Well, for an economic profit, you would simply drop your AC curve down because remember, at this point here where your quantity is, your average revenue must be greater than your average cost. Whereas if we were looking at an economic loss, all we would do is shift that AC curve up so that we were able to show an economic loss. It is as straightforward as that. And that's why learning to draw at least one of these graphs absolutely accurately becomes a help then for anything else that you've got to show. Makes it a lot easier for you. All right, so let's go and have a look at what they might look like. There would be economic profit. That's what we would do for economic profit, and that's what we would do for economic loss. And in each of these cases, what you would do is you would go and show where does that quantity intersect with that average cost curve. And in this case, we would be looking at this being my cost here, or my average cost would be there, and that would be giving me economic profit. And then if I wanted to go to my loss situation, let's grab a different color. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to where, once again, I'm going to extend this line up, and then I'm going to take it across. And that's going to be, again, my cost. And now it shows me that my cost is higher than my average revenue. In other words, each unit that I sell is costing me more than what I'm getting in for the price of that. And that here is then showing me, let's do it with our yellow. This is then showing me my economic loss. There's my economic loss. So folks, if you learn it like that, you should be able to deal with any graph for perfect competition. All right, that's perfect competition done. Let's go and have a look at one or two of the others. Here we go for monopolist. So notice now we're looking at monopolist. And please, you've got to be really, really careful. What does the question say? A lot of students lose marks unnecessarily because they read the question incorrectly or interpret it incorrectly. This is now asking us for a monopoly. Once again, same story. You start with your axes. There's what I've done for you first. Notice here I've done unit revenue cost because that is what would be a preferable heading for it. But as I say, the textbook doesn't do that, so we can't make you do that. Notice though this NB here. Price is equal to average revenue. Price is always equal to average revenue, no matter which market structure you're in. But it is not equal to marginal revenue in imperfect competition. For all our imperfect competition market structures, monopoly, monopolistic competition, we will see this downward sloping demand curve with a MR that is not equal to AR. And therefore, your MR must be below your AR. These folks, this is often where students go wrong. They confuse this. Learn it. Just learn what it looks like and don't mess it up. All right. Then your next trick is still your Nike tick, your MC curve. In comes our MC curve because that is going to identify for us our output, our equilibrium, and the level of output we're going to produce. So what quantity do we hope to sell in this organization? That is the quantity that we're aiming to sell. Now we want to ask ourselves, what is the price? Well, in order to get the price, we're going to have to go up to the price line. And that will show us the price that we are going to charge for this particular quantity. Now, once again, my firm, my monopolist, is now in equilibrium. But at this stage, we do not know how much profit we are making. Once again, we've got to decide. What does the question tell us? Does it tell us economic profit? Does it tell us normal profit? Or does it tell us economic loss? That will determine where you put your average cost curve. In exactly the same way as you worked with the average cost curve in your perfect competition, you will work with your average cost curve in monopoly or monopolistic competition. In this case, we're going to go, I think I've done economic profit, so let's have a look. There we go. I'm doing economic profit. How do I know this is economic profit? Because I can see there's my AR or my price, and I can see that my average cost is lower than my price. Therefore, I am indicating that this firm is making an economic profit. And there we have it. Simple and straightforward as that. Your trick, of course, in distinguishing between your market structures is the shape or the lie of your demand curve. Because in perfect competition, your demand curve for your firm is a straight line, whereas in imperfect competition, your demand curve for the firm is a downward sloping demand curve. Pay attention to that, ladies and gents. Pay attention, because that's often what catches students in that exam. Luckily for the monopolist, he or she is able to continue to make economic profit in both the short run and the long run. Why? Because there are barriers to entry, and nobody can come in and compete away that profit. Know the whole story. And then, of course, if you want to show loss for your monopolist, all you're going to do is move the position of your AC curve. There goes my AC curve. Now my monopolist is still going to operate where MR is equal to MC. Let's just put the AC curve in so it stays for a moment. So there's my AC curve now, and my monopolist is still operating where MR is equal to MC, but notice now that the cost is higher than the average revenue, and therefore this area here would illustrate a loss for my monopolist. Once again, be aware though that a monopolist will not continue to make an economic loss in the long run. So a loss situation is only going to be applicable in the short run for the monopolist. And that's something you would want to remember in your description or in your explanation if you were explaining to us a monopolist making an economic loss. They're unlikely to continue to make that loss in the long run. It's not sustainable. That was your monopolist. Now what we're going to do is go and have a quick look at our monopolistic competition. And notice that the graph does not change much because it looks almost identical in the short run. Watch out for that, folks. When they give you this information, what are they giving you? Is it monopolistic competition or is it monopoly? Now remember, you've got two key ways of telling the difference here. Monopoly would be there's barriers to entry and there's a single firm. In the case of monopolistic competition, there are many firms. Many firms. Please remember that. Monopolistic competition, we have many firms, and there are no barriers to entry. There's freedom of entry into and out of that market. And then in addition, for monopolistic competition, we've got differentiated products. And those are the key elements that are going to help you distinguish between your monopoly and your monopolistic competition. As I say, in the short run, your graph looks much the same. In this particular case, we've got our downward sloping demand curve, we've got our MR curve, we've got our MR is equal to MC position, which gives us our output, it gives us our price, and we have illustrated that in this particular case, our monopolistically competitive firm is able to make economic profit. I was just reading Justin's comment there. Please be careful. Monopoly and monopolistic competition are not the same. Or even a monopolistic firm and monopolistic competition. Monopolistic firm is a monopoly and monopolistic competition is monopolistic competition. All right, so please be careful. You lose 10 marks because you've misinterpreted the information. But back to our monopolistically competitive firm. That little cafe that you are running in your area is monopolistic competition because there's freedom of entry into the market and anybody can come in and compete with you. So you're happily going about your business, making your economic profit, but then a whole bunch of new cafes open down the road, got slightly different products, but now they're competing with you. And so what is going to happen in the long run, you will not be able to continue making economic profit, and you will end up making only a normal profit. Making sure that you distinguish for monopolistic competition clearly between what your graph would look like in the short run and what your graph potentially would look like in the long run. All right, so in the long run, you're going to be making only normal profit. Now, notice I've put in an L for the LMC and an L for the LAC, which generally they don't indicate that we should do, but I like to do it because then it clearly indicates for us that we are in the long run as opposed to just being in the short run. But ladies and gents, I hope if there's one thing I've been able to illustrate for you here is how to go about learning and drawing and explaining these graphs. Because if that's what we've achieved, then we are halfway to getting you through that exam. Please note that I haven't spent much time on oligopolies. That does not mean it's not important. The only reason that I haven't is because it's pure theory. Your oligopolistic market structure, you've got to learn what are the characteristics, what is collusion, why do companies collude, what are the requirements for successful collusion, and then be able to tell us, obviously, describe what does an oligopolist look like. You don't have any graphs there. And so I haven't really focused on much in terms of application. There isn't a lot of application that we can ask you on oligopoly because of the fact that we don't have graphs, all right? But that does not mean that the theory is not super, super important. And then the last section that I've given you a little bit of a heads up, and that is, and the reason that I've done that is because often students forget to study this, and that is your competition policy. Please, it is at the end of Learning Unit 9, and invariably there's a question on it in the final exam. Once again, it is a theory, so just make sure that you've learned it. I've just given you an idea of some of what they could ask, the aims, what are the institutions that the Competition Act provides for, and then what is it responsible for? And then just making sure that you can distinguish between these different concepts. If they are asking you aims, don't give us responsibility because we're not asking for responsibility. That just means that when you're studying it, you need to be very clear on what you're or how you're filing it in your brain so that you can find it in the exam. So there's an idea of your competition policy of what you would require. Your comparisons, one of the important things in this section as well is your comparisons. I haven't focused on that because it is my opinion that once you clearly understand what is perfect competition, what is monopoly, what is monopolistic competition, what is oligopoly, you will be able to do those comparisons. And you should be able then to to represent them correctly from a theoretical perspective or even from a graphical perspective. There are two graphs. I know Joshua was mentioning those two that we do from this section. They are not very frequently asked. And my honest feeling is that you focus first on understanding what each of the individual graphs look like, be totally comfortable with them. And then I think you'll be able to pick up that last graph, which I think shows the comparison between the different market structures. Folks, there's also another section that I haven't really covered in much detail, and that is your natural monopoly. Now, it has come up in previous exams, I think once. Just do be aware what does a natural monopoly look like and how it is regulated by government. And why it is regulated by government. Please do have a look at that as well, just to be absolutely sure, particularly if you're trying to go for a distinction in economics. A quick question for you, one or two questions for you. So if you can go in and answer these two questions, pop it into the chat if you can. And just let's see how on track you are. So let's try question number 1. You can do both at the same time if you like, and then I'll talk to you whether you are correct or not. Just waiting to see if anybody's able to answer. Well, let's see, Nathan, what you said for question number 1B, you are correct, absolutely. And for question number 2, an explicit agreement would be cartel oligopoly. Well done. So Nathan has answered those 2 questions correctly. Ladies and gents, for you that were unable potentially to answer question number 1, go back to your MR is equal to MC rule. That's what it's based on. If you're understanding that MR is equal to MC, what happens if MR is greater than MC, what happens if MR is less than MC, is going to get you on the right track for question number 1. Question number 2 is simple theory. That I was talking about earlier from your oligopoly market structure, making sure that you are able to answer all of those kind of questions. And that takes us to the end of market structures. I hope that I've given you a little bit of guidance there. Remember, we can't cover everything in this tutorial or this masterclass. So what we do is we focus on what are the absolute critical core concepts that you have to be comfortable with going into any exam for PMIC. And that brings us to Learning Unit 10, which is, of course, our labour market. Please be warned, there's invariably a question from the labour market, if not more than one, which you're going to be asked. And often there are simple, straightforward theory questions. What do I mean by that? Simple learning. You don't even have to necessarily understand it, but you have to have learned it correctly. So looking at the labour market, there's some of your questions that you must be able to answer. Obviously, the starting one, your differences between your labour market and your goods market, but then notice the 2 that give us trouble are question number 2 and question number 6. Identify 5 requirements for a perfectly competitive labour market, and then describe 4 factors that make the labour market imperfect. Because in this one chapter, you are first studying a perfectly competitive labour market, and then you are studying imperfect competition in the labour market. Please be aware of that. And watch out for what is the question actually asking you. All right. A lot of theory to learn here. And as I say, you probably will be asked between 2 or 3 questions out of this section, just asking you pure theory. And often it's even more than that. It's in the past, this learning unit can even count for up to 15, 20% of the actual marks. Please do be sure that you are able to answer all of these questions. We're going to take a quick look at some of it, obviously not all of it, but at least some of this learning unit, and just advise you what to focus on to make sure that you absolutely have to be comfortable with certain elements going into that exam. First point, equilibrium in the labour market, and then making sure that you can draw it accurately. Don't make silly errors like putting in P and Q when you need wage rate and units of labour or quantity of labour. The textbook says quantity of labour. I stay away from quantity of labour, mostly because I want to avoid the problem of students saying quantity on that axis and then not being able to get the mark. If you say quantity of labour, you're fine. But if you just put quantity on this axis here, you've got a problem. And also, we don't use Q here. We use N. And that's why I stay away from quantity in my graphs to try and urge students to not make that mistake. Obviously, how do we describe equilibrium in the labour market? It is still where the quantity of labour demanded is equal to the quantity of labour supplied at the equilibrium wage. Your concept is still much the same. It's your terminology that you're using that you have to be careful. Are you describing it correctly? And then also remember that if we're asking you about a wage that is higher, so if our wage was higher, and let's make it a dotted. So if we had a wage in the market that was here, not set by government, all right, but just if this was where the wage was sitting, we would have excess supply of labour that would put downward pressure on the wage rate until we got to equilibrium. Or if our wage rate was too low, what we would have would be excess demand for labour that would put upward pressure on the wage rate until we restored equilibrium. We have the normal market forces that are operating in the perfectly competitive labor market. Please, another thing to watch out for is, remember, demand for labor is firms. So this is where the firms are operating, and supply of labor is us, the workers. All right, not confusing those two and reverting to Learning Unit 3 and Learning Unit 4 in your thinking. Your market supply of labor, why is it a positive sloping curve? I'm going to go back for a moment just to have a look. Why does this supply curve slope upwards for labor? That is because more people are, let's put it correctly, as the wage rate increases, more people are willing to offer their services in that market. All right, so remember to describe it correctly. As the wage rate goes up, so more people are willing to work at that wage, hence our positive relationship between the wage rate and the units of labor. Looking at your determinants of supply of labor, remember that your wage rate will cause a movement along the supply curve, whereas non-wage factors, those are other things that can impact on the supply of labor, will cause a shift of your supply curve. You need to be aware of that. If the number of workers in the market increases, my supply of labor will shift to the right. The supply of labor has increased. Making sure that you can go through each of these and be able to describe or discuss or recognize what will happen in each of those cases, and be able to list them. If we simply ask you, what are the determinants of supply of labor, market supply of labor in the labor market? Your demand for labor, or your market demand for labor. Now notice we say market demand or market supply because you've now got to be able to distinguish between, in the case of supply, the individual supply of labor versus the market supply of labor, whereas in the demand for labor, we're looking at the market demand for labor versus the demand for labor by the firm, making sure that when you study it, you're seeing those differences. Looking at market demand for labor, why will it be downward sloping? Well, that's simple. The higher the wage, the lower the quantity of labor demanded. The lower the wage, the more people we will hire, therefore the higher the quantity of labor demanded. Making sure, once again, that you can describe that simple relationship. And then your determinants of demand for labor, once again, your wage rate, which will cause a movement along the demand curve, and then your non-wage factors that will cause a shifting of that demand curve. Students, what you should notice at this point is that your rules are very similar to what they were in Learning Unit 3 and 4. In other words, distinguishing between a movement along the demand curve and a shifting of the demand curve for labor. Watch out for that. There's two tricky ones here, two problem ones for students. Mostly number of firms hiring, most students will be comfortable with that. If the number of firms that are hiring increases, my demand curve is going to shift to the right. If the number of firms hiring decreases, it's going to shift to the left. The problem is these two here. Make sure that you are comfortable with what their effect will be. I'll talk just now about the price of the product and what its impact is on the demand curve, and then remembering change in productivity of workers as well. If our workers are more productive, we will hire more workers. And you will see that clearly just now when we do the demand for the firm, the demand for labor of a firm in a perfectly competitive labor market. But this is just a heads up. Please make sure. Can you give us the determinants of the supply of labor? Are you able to identify the determinants for the demand for labor? And then, of course, going in and applying this particular information that we've given you in an exam question. So this was a question, I think, from 2022. Graphically illustrate the effect on the equilibrium wage rate and the equilibrium level of employment if there is an increase in the number of workers entering the labor market due to immigration. Now, they didn't ask you to explain in this case, they just simply asked you to illustrate the effect on the equilibrium. What would your graph have looked like? Now, this is the kind of point where if we had more time, but I don't want to waste your time or your data, is what you would do is you would draw this graph. And ideally, if we were in the classroom, I would like to see how you've drawn this graph. And that's why I often say to students now, when you see a question like this, if you quickly go, even just do a rough graph, what do you think it would look like? And then you can quickly check yourself, did I get it right? And that's what we would expect it to look like. It would have been an increase in the supply of labor. So you would have started off with your normal equilibrium that I showed you on the previous slide earlier. And then you would have shown a rightward shift of your supply curve. And you'll show me that the wage rate, the equilibrium wage rate, will decrease while the number of people employed in the economy will increase, or in this industry rather, will increase. Being able to simply show what is the impact on equilibrium. This was a super easy question that gave 7 easy marks for a student who was able to answer it. And of course, they can ask you any of those determinants. Any of those determinants, when they change, what is going to be the impact in your labor market? Here is the one I was talking to you about earlier, which has come up in so many exams, folks. They keep asking it. I'm not sure why, but they obviously like it. And they ask it over and over and again, and it's usually for 10 marks. Please be sure that you are comfortable with it. Now, the numbers are irrelevant. You don't have to use my numbers. I've just used the ones that were originally in the textbook, and that just makes it easier to draw. But once again, you can use whatever your lecturers have given you to. But what is important here is the shape of this curve. This is the individual supply curve. Now, each one of us as workers in the economy, we will face this kind of supply curve for labor. What does it actually tell us? It tells us that initially, as the wage rate increases, you or me will be prepared to work more hours. We want to make more money. So as that wage is going up, we are prepared to work more hours. That's a positive relationship, and that is the substitution effect. Once we are earning, or once the wage rate gets high enough and we are earning a level of income that we are comfortable with, it is possible for us to start working less time. It doesn't decrease our income. In fact, it is possible that our income continues to go up, but we do not have to work as much. We are able to enjoy more leisure. And therefore, we have now what we call a negative relationship, or an inverse relationship. And that is the income effect. Folks, do not mix these two up, all right? Your income effect is your inverse relationship between the wage rate and how many hours you will work. And the substitution effect has a positive relationship between the wage rate and how many hours you will work. Make sure you can describe these accurately. And that's what I've done on the next slide, is I've given you that description for substitution effect and income effect. A very brief, concise description for each of them. Hopefully, if you get this question in the exam, you will all be able to answer it correctly. Then we go on to what is the most challenging part, in my opinion, for most students in this section, and that is deriving a firm's demand curve for labor. Students, please know the theory as well as the terminology, and then obviously also the application. So remember that demand is a derived demand. Make sure you can explain what that means. I say then, assume that you run a small firm. What are the 2 most important factors that would help you decide how many workers to hire? And this is rational behavior. You would look at what is the cost of your worker and what is the benefit that you're going to receive from that worker. Just checking what Joshua is saying. So just always pay attention to Joshua. Thanks, Joshua, again, for his commentary. Hugely beneficial to you and also very, very useful. So just note what he says to us as we go as well. Looking at your cost, you now got to pay attention to terminology. Marginal cost of labor, MCL, known as MCL, which is the wage rate. All right, so these are things now that you can learn, folks. Your benefit that you receive is your marginal revenue product, and that is your MRP. How do we calculate your MRP? It is marginal physical product times price. Now, what do we mean by all of this? Well, just let's put you into a situation for a moment. When you're going to hire somebody, you always have to take into account how much you're going to pay them in relation to what they contribute to your organization. Because if you are paying them way more than they're contributing, it's unsustainable. You're going to go out of business. If you're paying them way less than they're contributing, that's great for you, but that may not be so great for the workers. So you've got to get this fine balance between what is the cost of the worker, what is the benefit of the worker, and how many workers are you able to hire. And that's what the calculations help us work out. So when you are looking at a table like this that you've got to go in and be able to complete, you've got to be able to identify what is the marginal product that each worker is going to produce, what is the price of your product, and then what is the value or the benefit that each worker is adding to your organization. And here's where terminology comes in again. Please watch out, folks. Total units produced is now known as total physical product, TPP. Marginal product or marginal output is known as MPP. Still the same as what you learned, when we were doing it in the production for Learning Unit 7, the concept is still exactly the same. It just has a different name. It's called marginal physical product, because now I want to know I want to distinguish between what is the physical addition that you are making in my organization versus what is the rand value of that addition that you're making. And that is why we distinguish now between marginal physical product and marginal revenue product. And your marginal revenue product is simply your price times your marginal physical product. And for a moment now, I want to go back to that question that information I gave you a little bit earlier regarding the determinants of demand for labor. Your marginal revenue product is in effect your demand curve for labor. That is the origin of the demand curve for labor. So once we know what the MRP looks like, we know what our demand curve looks like. And if anything changes in these calculations, that demand curve has to change. Therefore, if the price of the product changes, it is going to impact on my demand curve for labor. If the physical output of my workers changes, in other words, if they become more productive or less productive, that is also going to impact on the demand curve for labor. I'm hoping I've given you a little bit of a clue as to what you need to be aware of when you're dealing with demand for labor. There's not much else I can do in the time frame that we've got now, but just showing you that link is super important. And that brings us to looking at equilibrium for the firm and equilibrium for the labor market on the same slide. Here is our equilibrium for the labor market. We've already been introduced to that. What does equilibrium for the firm look like in a perfectly competitive labor market? Being able to show us that that is the MCL, marginal cost of labor, which is also the wage rate, and that is our supply curve of labor for the firm. What do we know from this graph that we see in front of us now? We know that we are wage takers. We simply have to accept the wage that is determined in the market. That's us as the workers in this particular industry. We have to accept the wage that is determined in the market. No negotiation for us, all right? We just simply have to accept it. And then we put in our demand curve for labor for the firm, which is in effect the MRP curve. That is your marginal revenue product curve, and that now shows us how many workers we will be able to hire given the prevailing wage rate. So once we know what the wage rate is in an industry, we then work out what is the marginal revenue product that each worker is able to contribute, and we work out that we will hire workers up to that point where MRP, marginal revenue product, is equal to the wage rate. And ladies and gents, that was your last two equilibrium positions that you were introduced to in this syllabus this semester. And that is, I say here, last two equilibriums for PMIC was your equilibrium in the labor market and then your equilibrium of the firm in the perfectly competitive labor market. Hopefully you knew them up front when we started, So you now have just been able to confirm what you should be comfortable with. Intervention in the labor market. Before we go on break, I'm going to finish the labor market so that when we come back, we will be just looking at purely revision of everything else that you've actually done already in test 1 and test 2. So intervention in the labor market will make the labor market imperfect. So this is one of the first things that will now change us from being a perfectly competitive labor market to being an imperfectly competitive labor market. And of course, that intervention can be through two main sources. That is through trade unions, which you must be comfortable. You must be able to tell us what is a trade union, describe the role of the trade unions, and identify the different types of trade unions. And then on the other hand, you've got one important section that you study, which expects you to be able to draw the graphs and illustrate how trade unions can increase wages in the labor market. In other words, how would they usually intervene? And there's 3 graphs there that you need to be able to explain. And what it does is it says there are 3 ways mainly that trade unions will try and increase the wage rate in a particular industry. And the one is that they can limit supply of labor into the industry, which immediately then increases the wage rate, but it also decreases the number of people employed. So making sure you can do each of those. The second one, if I'm not mistaken, is a minimum wage in a particular industry. Trade unions can try and implement minimum wages in a particular trade industry. That would just simply give you a minimum wage would be above your equilibrium wage. That would force us into disequilibrium. Once again, we would see a decrease in the number of people that are being employed in that particular market. And then we've got the one that is a good-looking one for us, but is difficult to achieve, and that is an increase in the demand for labor. By encouraging the production of goods and services in South Africa through investment or through Buy South African campaigns, what we could do is see an increase in the production in South Africa, and that would in turn lead to an increase in the demand for labor in the economy. And of course, if we have an increase in the demand for labor, you'll notice that we have an increase both in the equilibrium wage and in the level of employment in the economy. And therefore, we would see a decrease in unemployment in the economy. Please remember that when you are discussing the labor market, you've got 3 aspects. You've got your equilibrium wage, you've got the number of people employed, and then you've got the impact on unemployment as well. And the last graph that you need to be comfortable with is your government intervention in the labor market, and that is the implementation by government of a minimum wage. And remember, the difference between trade unions and government is that when government implements a minimum wage, everybody in the economy has to oblige. They have to implement it. Whereas with trade unions, it would be industry specific. So ladies and gents, that's the end of the labor market. I'm hoping that that's given you a little bit of insight into what is absolutely critical there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take a slightly shorter break, just 7 minutes, and we'll be back on the hour to do the last bit as much as we can in that last hour. Alrighty, folks. And now we go back in time. We want to look quickly at some of the things that you've got to know with demand and supply. And also you are welcome to stop me at any point if there's anything. Just want to check that you can hear me. Just a quick indication.
We can hear you, Tammy.
Thanks, Josh, because it's telling me my mic is muted in front of me here, but it looks like it's working. All right, thanks, Josh, and now please feel free also to jump in if there's anything that you want to add that I might have forgotten. We're looking, folks, at demand and supply, which is obviously Learning Unit 3 and Learning Unit 4. We just want to check some of the things that you might have missed there and that are going to be critical for the exam. All right. So very summarized for you, but the things that you've absolutely got to know is, can you define demand? Do you know your law of demand? These are things that we expect now that you are familiar with because you will have studied them for previous tests. Your determinants of demand. Now be careful because your determinants now are applied in various different contexts. What are they asking you for? Is it demand for the goods market? Is it demand for the labor market? Is it for price elasticity of demand? What must you apply those determinants to? If you've studied it carefully and with some sort of conscious thought, you'll be fine. But if not, you just see that word determinants and then you just give us whatever comes to mind first. So do be super careful when you are learning them, all right? And then, of course, being able to identify, which I have done for you here, all of your different letters. I like to remember it in letters just because it makes it easier for my memory, but you may want to remember it in actual words. So that would be your price of your actual product, which is PX, and then all of the others, price of substitutes, price of complements, income of consumers, tastes of consumers, number of consumers, and then don't forget that your ... are also important factors, your expected future price and your income distribution for demand. And then remember your rules. Rules, folks, always important. What is it that causes a shift and what is it that causes a movement along? And then remembering the terminology that goes with that. A shift is a change in demand, whereas a movement along is a change in quantity demanded. Being able to do obviously exactly the same for supply, we'll get there in a moment. Just a reminder of your difference between quantity demanded, which is a movement along the demand curve caused by a change in price, and a shifting of the demand curve, which is caused by any other factor, but not the price. Now, the reason that I'm just emphasizing this again is that I picked up in test 2 that there were still students that were confusing these two concepts. You've got to get it right now, right, for that final exam. Here's your supply story, same defined supply. Are you able to tell us what is supply? What is the relationship between price and quantity supplied? What are your determinants in the labor market? Not in the labor market, I'm still thinking labor market, in your goods market now for market supply. And then what are all of these determinants that are going to impact on market supply and how do they impact? In other words, do they cause a shift or do they cause a movement along? Bit of useful information there. If you know all of this, you're pretty much on the right track when it comes to some of those shorter questions that can be asked for demand and supply. And then, of course, we go into the market, and that is your market equilibrium, and understanding the operation of market forces and being able to describe what is going to happen in your market equilibrium position. And when we're not in equilibrium, when we're in a position of disequilibrium, what does that mean? And remember, your two main disequilibrium positions are excess supply, which will be a surplus, and excess demand, which will be a shortage. And remember which one is above the equilibrium price and which one is below the equilibrium price. These are little things that can be asked, which we find that students still somewhat confused in the final exam. And then, of course, what does your market equilibrium look like? Very familiar graph to you at this stage, I'm sure. And then being able to deal with changes. Now, it is possible that they still ask you a long question on this in the final exam. it'll be considered a super easy question for you. You want to get full marks for it. This is something you've already studied, and if you're asked it now, we expect you to be able to answer it. Make sure that you can. And of course, there have been questions, I think I've got one or two coming up in a moment, that have been asked in previous exams. When you're faced with your equilibrium position like this, you've got to first decide, when they give you the scenario, which curve is being affected. In other words, is it demand or is it supply? Which way is it going to shift? Remember, a shift to the right is always an increase, a shift to the left is always a decrease. And then what is the impact going to be on the equilibrium price and quantity? And here's one of the questions that was asked fairly recently, giving you a moment to read it. And a little bit of advice, students, whenever you are reading these questions in the exam, is to highlight what's important. So, for example, highlighting first of all that what is going to happen in the market for beef, so that you know which graph it is that you're going to be illustrating. And then what has happened. We see that there's a substitute in consumption of beef has changed, and we can see that it was a decrease in the price of a substitute. So looking at each of these bits of information and making sure that you acknowledge them, and then you're less likely to make a silly mistake in that answer that you're going to provide us with. And there was your answer. So looking at what has happened there, as a result of the decrease in the price of pork, we are going to see our consumers stop consuming beef and rather consume pork, and therefore our demand curve for beef is going to shift to the left. And then we just read our graph. As a result of that leftward shift of the demand curve, we can see what's happened to equilibrium price and what has happened to equilibrium quantity. And then making sure that you're able to tell us that. Fairly straightforward. The trick is identifying which curve is going to shift which way, and then being able to illustrate it accurately for us. One of the ones which is more challenging for most students is, of course, if they give you that simultaneous change. Now they're giving you two scenarios. One is affecting demand, one is affecting supply, and you're having to shift both of those curves. Folks, just watch out that you have practiced at least once or twice, otherwise you will struggle with these types of questions. Here was a question from a previous paper, quite some time back, 2019. Going to give you a chance just to read through that. First thing you want to do is identify which curves are being affected. So if we look at the price of grapes used in production of wine, that tells you that it's got to be supply. So that is your supply curve. And you want to write down here, supply is going to decrease because the cost of production has increased. Remember, that's our rule. That's part of the rules that we learned in Learning Unit 3. Cost of production has increased, therefore supply of wine will decrease. Research results have recently been published that prove that wine is healthy and that a glass a day is beneficial, and that, of course, is going to be your demand, and that we assume is going to cause demand to increase. Once we've identified that, we go in and we start drawing our graph, and we know that this is what our graph must look like. We can see there was the increase in my demand. There was the decrease in my supply. I know it's not super clear, but at least it gives you an idea. And now, what was the trick with this simultaneous change is that you're going to end up with at least one outcome, and in this case, it's the quantity, which is going to be uncertain. How do we know in this case that the quantity is uncertain? Because usually when it stays the same, we know that if we had have changed the magnitude of the changes, in other words, for example, if I had have shifted my supply curve more than I shifted my demand curve, I would have seen a different outcome for quantity. And that is what will tell us. And that is where you've got to understand the individual market forces. When demand increases, what does it do? It puts upward pressure on the price. When supply decreases, what does it do? it also puts upward pressure on the price. So therefore, we know that in both cases, that price is going to go up. There's no uncertainty regarding price, but we don't know in terms of quantity, because an increase in demand means we want more, but a decrease in supply means that we are supplying less. And so we have those opposing forces in terms of quantity, and that means that the outcome is going to be uncertain. And that is because the question did not give us any additional information. If it had have told us potentially that the magnitude of these changes is the same, then we would have known that this will be the answer. Whereas if they said to us supply decreases more than demand increases, then we know that that is the outcome that we have to represent. All right, so it's just a case of being careful when you're doing it, shifting your curves in the right direction, and then being able to read your graph accurately. Please do make sure that you are prepped for something like that. And then, of course, we've got this section, which is always a challenge for students, and that is government intervention. Now, there's quite a lot of theory here. Please make sure that you've learned your theory as well, and then just be able to do your graphs and be able to explain what you're doing in each case. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you have done it in preparation for test 2. This is just a reminder of what you need to be able to do. So there's a little bit of summarized information for you. It helps you to get your answers right. If you can remember that maximum is to help consumers, minimum is to help producers. And then remembering that we're no longer in equilibrium. So as soon as government intervenes, they force us into a disequilibrium position. Types of questions. Easy question you could be asked: give 2 reasons why government should be advised against setting price ceilings in a particular market. And that would be because of the consequences. What is it that actually happens as a result of implementing those prices? And then also briefly explain how government setting a price floor below the equilibrium price will affect the market for a particular good. Now, if we are looking at a minimum price, can anybody tell me setting a price floor, a minimum price below the equilibrium price will affect the market for a particular good? Can anybody tell me very, very briefly if there will be an impact on the market or not? For that last question. Price floor below equilibrium price. You can just put yes, there will be an impact, or no, there won't be an impact. Just waiting to see if I'm going to get any more. Well done, Latabo. Well done. Nope, there won't be, because it won't be effective. All right. Remember, price floor or minimum price has to be above. So important to remember all of that, students. I can't stress it enough. All right. Well done to those of you who answered. Looking at welfare costs now, if we're looking at the welfare costs of government intervention, what are we wanting you to tell us or deal with? You've got to be able to tell us in each case for maximum and for minimum, obviously. And then your welfare costs will analyze or investigate what happens to consumer and producer surplus, who loses, who gains, deadweight loss, and then also making sure that you can draw the graph. Remember, deadweight loss is a loss to society, but then you've got to be able to break that deadweight loss down to the deadweight loss to consumer surplus, deadweight loss to producer surplus, and then what happens to the surplus between consumer and producer, being able to show how that changes. So there's quite a lot of stuff, but if you think of it in these terms and you're able to do each of these steps, you pretty much will be able to deal with whatever the question is that they ask you. And of course, that takes us to our graphs. And this was where I said to you, it's really important for you to remember where is consumer surplus, where is producer surplus. Then that helps you to understand better the impact of that maximum and that minimum price when it's implemented. And this was, of course, your welfare of a maximum price there goes your PM, there goes your what we call our auxiliary line, which identifies for us the quantity that will be bought and sold at the minimum price, or in this case, sorry, maximum price. And then we go into identifying the dead weight loss. A and C are our dead weight loss. And then we had to be able to identify what happened to that little rectangle. And we learned that that little rectangle in this particular case has moved from the producer to the consumer. So the consumer has gained and the producer has lost. Being able to read that graph, draw it, explain it, identify if they give it to you, what they're asking you about it. And then minimums above, reminding ourselves, once again, what is the quantity that will be bought and sold, and then being able to identify the dead weight loss. Notice it doesn't matter how you label it, as long as you correctly indicate what it is that you're showing us. And then that little surplus that has changed, in this case, it has moved from the consumer to the producer. Being able to do that is going to obviously help you answer most of the questions that would be asked. We've had a break, so we don't need to take it now. This was just in case that we managed to get there now. Chances are you're going to get questions on elasticities, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, you will have formulas in the formula sheet. That's not going to help you, though, if you don't understand and are able to apply your formulas. You need to, each time you do the calculations now when you're prepping for the exam, is please make sure you write down your formulas. Even though they're going to be there, you still want them in front of you when you're doing your calculations. Make sure you write them down and then put in the correct numbers, hopefully, into your calculation. I'm going to ask you to do one in a moment. Just a quick heads up, what you must watch out for. What is that question asking? There's a lot of different ways in which questions can be phrased. Are we looking at asking you what is elasticity? Simple question. Can you describe to us what is elasticity? I've noticed that a lot of my students are unable to do that. They kind of in their head have an idea of what it is, but they're unable to express it in words. Please be sure you've looked for a good description on elasticity. Then can you list the types of elasticity, categories of elasticity, determinants of elasticity? Make sure what is the question actually asking you. And then learn your rules. There's a whole bunch of rules we teach you here as well, which if you know them, you'll be able to apply them quite easily. And then, of course, what we're going to focus on now for a moment or two is calculating your elasticities. I'm only doing one calculation. This is one of the questions that appeared in a previous exam paper. And I'm going to ask you to go in now and just quickly see if you can calculate it. I'm going to give you a minute to do that. Write down your formula. Notice that it says the point elasticity formula in this particular case. I think in the exam it actually asked for the arc, but I've changed it to point now. You've got to know both, all right? But for now, we're going to look at point, and then we're going to use the information that we get in our answer to interpret. So I'd just like you quickly to try and see if you can do that calculation. Giving you a minute to do that. Right, folks. Now, for those of you who could do it in that short period of time, well done, because that means that you knew what your formula looked like and you were able to go in, write that formula down and put in the numbers. For those of you who didn't know where to start or were in a bit of a panic because you had to go and find where's this formula, that's what I'm talking about. You can't be too unsure. You need to at least know which formula that you're looking for so that you know when you go to your formula sheet what you'd be looking at. And Nathan, I think you're correct. If I remember rightly, that is the answer. And there you go. Yes, you're absolutely. And it is elastic. You are correct. So that was your calculation. It is elastic. Why is it elastic? Because it's greater than 1. Remember, we ignore that minus when we are reading the number. We do not read it as a negative number. We just look, is it greater than 1 or less than 1? In this case, it's greater than 1. Therefore, it is elastic. And what does that actually mean? If they're asking you to explain what does it mean when a product is elastic, it means that the percentage change in the quantity demanded is greater than the percentage change in price. Make sure that you can give that whole explanation, especially if it's for 2 or 3 marks that they're asking you that second question. All right, so that means that those of you who were able to do this, you're in a good starting position. Then just make sure, obviously, you know your ARC formula as well. Here's your different types of elasticity. So making sure you've got all these different types. What is it that they're asking you for? Once you kind of pay attention and you really learn them, you'll find that they're all so closely related. You'll easily be able to tell the difference when you are reading a question. Here's your point method that we've just used, and then you've also got your ARC method that you are there. Remember, there are 2 of the ARC methods. The one that is given in the textbook is this one at the top. This one also is perfectly, if a lecturer has taught you this, this is also perfectly acceptable. Just be careful, obviously, which one you're using, that you use that formula entirely correctly. Remember, in every case, this is what we're actually calculating. So it doesn't matter which method we're using. This is the actual calculation that we are making. Moving on to your categories of price elasticity of demand, your 5 categories. That could be an easy 5 or potentially 10-mark question that they ask you. What are your 5 categories of price elasticity of demand? And there you have them: perfectly inelastic, perfectly elastic, unit elastic, elastic, inelastic. Please be careful. Make sure you know what is inelastic. In other words, inelastic is less sensitive. And that would look like a steeper curve when you were drawing it. Whereas elastic is a much flatter curve. Consumers are much more sensitive, or demand is much more sensitive to a change in any variable. Making sure that you understand, and then you can explain it in terms of percentage change in quantity demanded related to percentage change in price. And of course, just as an example for perfectly inelastic, what does that actually tell us? It doesn't matter what the percentage change is in the price of the product. The quantity demanded is not going to change. Making sure that you know all of these descriptions and not just this list that you see in front of you. And then, of course, what each of the graphs looks like. Your rules for price elasticity and total revenue. Remember these rules that allow us to identify what is going to happen to total revenue if we put the price of our product up or we put the price of our product down, depending upon the elasticity of that product. Please pay attention to those rules. These questions often come up in multiple choice questions, or they'll come up as a result of the calculation that you've done. So once you've worked out my product is elastic, then it might ask you, for example, what should you do now to increase your total revenue? And then you must know, if my product is elastic, my total revenue and my price move in opposite directions, and therefore I should put down the price of my product in order to increase my total revenue. If you know these rules and understand them, you'll be A for away for any question they ask you. Income elasticity of demand. Once again, you must be able to tell us what it is, you must know the rules, and you must be able to do the calculation. And you'll see really all that changes in this formula here is that instead of having price, delta price, we have delta income. And instead of having original price and original quantity, we have original income and original quantity. Very little is actually changing in each of those formulas. And then remembering your rules, and this can be learned. So make sure you learn those rules and you'll be able to apply them in any question asked. Same applies for cross-elasticity of demand. Now, the trick here is remembering that you're looking at products that are substitutes or complements. And that means that you're going to have a change in the quantity of one product as a result of a change in the price of another product. You're going to be looking at that QA and PB, being able to represent that these are two different products, and we want to see how the change in the price of one impacts on another. I've been using a little example for students when I've been doing this and saying, imagine yourself with a little cafe and you like to sell coffees, and then you have toasted sandwiches or you have cakes, and you find the relationship between those cups of coffee and the number of cakes you sell. If you change the price of coffee, you find that that has an impact on the quantity demanded of cakes or toasted sandwiches, because people buy more or less coffee and they always want to have their coffee with something else, a biscuit or a toasted sandwich or a cake of some sort. So that gives you a nice little illustration of how they could give you a scenario looking at cross-elasticity of demand. Once again, don't forget your price elasticity of supply. It's right at the end. We often tend to forget it, and then that's the one they ask in the exam. But it operates exactly the same. Just remember your terminology's got to be different, because now you're talking about quantity supplied and not quantity demanded. And then you've also got your 5 categories. Your 5 categories are named the same, but remember this would be, again, ES, and ES would be referring to supply. And then please, from a purely theoretical perspective, folks, can you give us the determinants of price elasticity of demand? And can you give us the determinants of price elasticity of supply? 2 easy bits of information which students often forget in that final exam. There's going to be a question from Learning Unit 7 and Learning Unit 8. We just don't know what. Are they going to do like they did in the test, ask you both, which they did, which was a table from Learning Unit, from Chapter 7 and a graph from Chapter 8. Please be comfortable with both. Once again, we're going to go through it quite quickly because the assumption is that you've done quite a lot of work on this already. There's some of your questions that you can expect from this section. Obviously, your first 2 are fairly straightforward and easy. Those are theory. Make sure you've learned them. And then, of course, you've got these 2 potentially much more difficult questions that can be asked. And that's going to require you to do a bit of practice, making sure, are you able to draw the graphs? And then are you able to do the explanations adequately? Once again, a summarized approach to this learning unit. What is utility? Remember, please, when I've been asking students what is utility, and I think one of the true-false questions in test 2 asked you, could we associate utility with firms? And students said it was true. No, utility is associated with consumers. All right, so please, folks, remembering what you are doing with utility, that it applies to consumers. And then the 2 different types of utility, as they refer to in the textbook as 2 notions, and that is your cardinal utility and your ordinal utility. Also a frequently asked question, folks. Easy 4 marks, potentially 6 marks if they ask you to give examples as well. Describe the difference between cardinal utility and ordinal utility, or name and describe the 2 different ways that we can deal with utility. Please watch out for that one. Here I say cardinal utility, remember, links to Chapter 7. That is looking at marginal utility, total utility, and being able to do your calculations. And that is where you are introduced to the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, don't confuse the law of diminishing marginal utility with the law of diminishing marginal returns, be very careful. Returns is with production, whereas utility is with consumer consumption, all right? And then making sure, can you describe marginal utility, and then can you also do the calculations? I think I've got a very easy table for you here. The table in the test too was also super easy, but many students were not able to complete it. You need to be able to complete a simple, straightforward table like this. Make sure that you still can. We don't know if they'll be asking it in the final exam, but the chances are that it could be there and it could be easy marks for you. And then being able to tell us it here, it must be 20. And then being able to tell us here that it is 101. And then here that we've got -2. Being able to complete a table like that, absolutely important for that exam. And then, of course, we get to the more difficult section, which is your indifference curve analysis, and that's based on ordinal utility. So this is your learning unit 8. And what we're going to, learning unit 6, chapter 8, and now you need to be able to draw the graphs. So in that first part, there's no graphs that are relevant, it's just the calculations, whereas now when we get to this part, it's all of your graphs that are relevant, and being able to particularly do the last few more difficult graphs that are required. Here's your indifference curve, reminding you what your indifference curve looks like. And remember, folks, even though you can't see it all that clearly, you've got quantity on each of the axes. All right, so there's nowhere here that we want to see price. It's quantity and quantity. And then watch out for assumptions of indifference curves. Do you know your assumptions? Completeness, consistency, non-satiation. And then do you know what MRS is? Marginal rate of substitution. Now you can see this is when I say to students, this is a way of studying smarter. We assume you've got the background information. Now what you want to be absolutely sure of is that you've got the critical information that you're able to take into that exam in your head. And that's where it becomes important to summarize efficiently so that you've got that information in a compact format that you can remember. So that's everything you need to know about indifference curves. Then you've got to be able to also tell us about the properties of indifference curves as opposed to the assumptions. So your assumptions are your CCN, I call it, completeness, consistency, non-satiation, and then your properties are what it looks like. It slopes downward, it's convex. A collection of indifference curves is an indifference map, and they can never touch or intersect each other. All right, so that's what it looks like. That's what your properties are. Then your second graph that you've got to understand in this section is your budget line. Now, your budget line shows you your limitations or your level of affordability. How much am I able to afford of these goods that I want to enjoy, given my income and the prices of these different goods? And I show you here very briefly, remember how to derive your budget line. You are looking at your intercept on your y-axis and your intercept on your x-axis. And as I say here, what you are doing is finding the maximum quantities of each good that you can afford to purchase with that budget. And of course, then that gives you your budget line. So if you were looking at drawing your budget line, you would simply be looking at this kind of scenario, which would give you a straight line budget line, as simple as that, showing you what you can afford with the income and given the prices of those goods. And this tells us if I had an income of 60 Rand and the price of bread was 10 Rand, the maximum number of loaves of bread I could purchase is 6, whereas the maximum portions of meat, given that the price of meat is 15 Rand, would be 4. Simple, straightforward as that. But what you've got to do is remember, where does this information come from? Because that is the tricky part when they're asking you conceptually about this budget line. If my income changes, it will shift my budget line, given that the prices remain the same. If the prices change, given that the income remains the same, it is going to swivel my budget line. And that's what you've got to be able to apply. We then go on to consumer equilibrium. What are we actually doing here? We are simply putting together how much you can afford with the level of satisfaction you can obtain. That's what we're looking at. And we're looking at a consumer. We're not looking at many consumers. And that's something that I see students actually often forget, is each of these graphs is a specific consumer. When you're talking in your explanation, you can't talk about consumers in general because it's not applying to consumers in general. It's applying to a specific consumer that we are looking at. When we put the indifference curve and the budget line together, we are getting consumer equilibrium, as opposed to any of the other equilibriums that you've been looking at today. This is your consumer equilibrium. How do we know where consumer equilibrium is? It's at that point where those two touch each other. We call that a point of tangency, where the budget line is tangent to the highest possible indifference curve. And now we are getting the best level of satisfaction that we can based on our affordability and our choices of these two products. Remember, what does an indifference curve show us? It shows us the level of satisfaction, a certain level of satisfaction that we enjoy as a result of the combination of two particular goods or services. And then what if? Once we've got our consumer equilibrium, we have to now go into what if. What if something changes? Well, first of all, we're going to look at what if income increases. Then we know what must happen already, because if income increases and prices remain the same, then my budget line will shift to the right. I can afford more. Remember, that's what it's showing us, how much we can purchase with the money that we have available. But now we mustn't forget, my budget line is shifted, but now I've got to see a new equilibrium position, a new consumer equilibrium position. So I must put in a new indifference curve. And there goes my indifference curve. Now, ladies and gents, in test 2, I noticed that there were students labeling their indifference curves, all different kinds of letters. No, 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 no. You can't, your indifference curves are utility curves. That's you. All right, make sure you get that right. You can't be naming them A's, B's, C's, D's, or whatever else you like. No, they are utility curves, and that is U1, U2, U3, U4, or just U if you like. And then your equilibrium position doesn't matter. This you can label anything you like, but just make sure you tell us what it is that you are indicating. All right. So in this particular case, I should, and I haven't on this slide, I should go and say A is original consumer equilibrium position, and B is the new equilibrium, consumer equilibrium position. And then, of course, if it is required, as we've said here, to derive the income consumption curve, then what we need to do is put in the income consumption curve and show it in our graph. And once again, folks, I hope that you're picking up from these graphs when we do them step by step, that is how you should be doing them for yourself. That's how you learn these graphs. All right. Just a reminder for you. And then what if price changes? Now, of course, this is the more challenging one. This is the one that I think that you got in your test 2, if I'm not mistaken. And that is if the price of the product changes. And now, just going back quickly, I just want us to go back to this so that you notice the difference. Do you notice here was a shift? And that shift was because income increased. What is going to happen now as a result of price changing is we're not going to see a shift, we're going to see a swivel, what I call a swivel. And I emphasize that because it just helps students get better clarity on the difference between these. Because what is going to happen now is the gradient of my curve is going to change. So what we do is we start off with our consumer income of 60 Rand, price of bread 10 Rand, original price of meat 15 Rand, which means that we could afford 4 units, and then the new price of meat is going to 20 Rand, which then tells me I can only afford 3 units of meat. So we're seeing an inward swivel. Remember, the price is not what is reflected on this line. It is quantity of meat. So therefore, if my price of meat has increased, that means I will be forced to consume less meat. And then we also mustn't forget our new equilibrium position. And our new equilibrium position is going to be on a lower indifference curve, lower level of satisfaction. Please note that I have omitted unintentionally of labeling my BL, my budget line. I should have labeled them as well, but I see that I've omitted it on this particular slide. There is my price consumption curve. And now from my price consumption curve, I am able to derive my demand curve for meat. I can only derive the demand curve for meat on this graph because I haven't looked at a change in the price of bread. And that is why you'll notice that the quantity of bread remains the same because the price of bread has not changed. Bearing in mind when you do your explanation, you can state that as well. Price of bread has not changed, therefore quantity remains the same. Now, if we had to go and derive the demand curve from my price consumption curve, what is the first thing that you should do, or I should do, if that's what I'm wanting to do, is I should draw up a little schedule. And there's my little schedule. So the price of meat changed from 15 to 20 Rand, and therefore the quantity of meat that I was able to purchase changed from 4 units to 3 units. And that then allows me to go in, and if I was required to draw my demand curve, I can go in and draw my demand curve, bearing in mind that you'd have here now price, and you would have here now quantity, and then you just plot your points. So we go in and we don't have to get all into all kinds of scaling and stuff here. We can just go and put in, just make sure you put your prices in the right order though. So 15 and 20. And then we can just put here 3 and 4. And we can then plot our points and we can draw our demand curve. But I always urge you to do this little schedule first because you're less likely to mess it up and make some silly mistakes. So there's my 3, there's my 4, and then I just join those two together, and there I have my demand curve. So just making sure that you're able to carry it all the way through. Thanks, Joshua, as well. Joshua's notes there are important in terms of when you are looking at your labeling accurately and clearly. And there you have it. This is the most difficult question that you could be asked in that final exam, and we'll be super impressed if anybody can answer that correctly. If you're able to do this, then we know, hey, they deserve to pass economics because they've really got this sorted. All right, we're almost at the end, and that is the first 2 learning units. Well, we can't forget about them completely. Mostly long questions don't come from them in the final exam. Notice I say mostly, not definitely, because they can surprise us every now and again. But they will still ask you maybe MCQs or true falses based on some of that information that we studied in Learning Unit 1 and Learning Unit 2. Let's take a quick look. Understanding the PPC, making sure that you still know your good old PPC. That was your very first graph that you learned in microeconomics. People battled with it. Little did you know where you were going to be in 3 months' time. I'm sure you can't believe that you actually even struggled with that graph now. Some of you have made great leaps in understanding how to use graphs and apply them and understand them. But please do go back to your PPC. Just make sure, do you know what it looks like? Do you know what we mean by attainable, unattainable, efficient, inefficient? Just being sure that you're still comfortable with it. And then knowing your difference between all of these micro, macro, positive, normative, stocks, flows, rates, and levels. I'm hoping by now this is not something you have to learn. This is something you now know. If you're still having to learn it, best you go back to it sooner rather than later. Economics as a social science, would you be able to answer? This was in one of the exam papers. They did ask, I think, for 5 marks, discuss economics or explain economics as a science. So making sure that you still are able to do something like that. Don't confuse the 3s. That's one of the problems that comes up because there's so many threes in those first 2 learning units that you study. 3 key economic concepts, that's your scarcity, choice, opportunity cost. Your 3 central questions, what to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce. Your 3 economic systems, your 3 basic economic systems, your 3 major flows, and 3 participants in a closed economy. So you can see there's a lot of this information that we now assume you know. Make sure that you are comfortable. There you have them all. Nice little ways to test yourself. Have I grasped all of this information? And then can I describe each of these? Most of this you should recognize. You've had questions on most of this in test 1 particularly. Remembering your economic circular flow model, once again, just understanding how it works, understanding the direction of the flows, potentially that could come up in a multiple choice question. And then can you answer these 3 questions? Name the main components of total spending in the economic circular flow model. What makes up the income flow in the economy, and list the main participants in an open economy. These are frequently asked questions which potentially could come up again in the final exam, making sure that you are able to answer all of them. And here are the answers for each of those, just in case you were not altogether sure. And that brings us to the end, which we have finished in almost 3 hours on the dot. For those of you who stuck it out for the entire time, well done, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so impressed. Hopefully some of you will find this useful again later. And I will be making sure that it gets through to the right place so that they can upload it for you onto YouTube. Thank you again, and best wishes for your exam, and I shall see you hopefully next semester. Take care. I will be sticking around, so if anybody's got any questions, you're welcome to ask them. Josh, if you're still there, I'm guessing you're comfortable that we covered most of what would be critical. Do you agree?
Yes, hi Tammy. Yeah, no, you covered just about that. And then, yeah, they got to read their questions carefully and that exam brief as well, and only do the 2 of the 3 questions in the last section.
Yeah, absolutely. And if they do all 3, just make sure they cross out which one they don't want us to mark. Otherwise, we end up marking the first 2, and then it's a bit tough sometimes. Yeah, I think we've done the core concepts. I'm sure, every now and then jumps into my head little things here and there that, oh dear, but we can't necessarily cover every option. So hopefully they've got some guidance. Yeah.
And when we went through with our students as well, now they have the holistic view of microeconomics. So if they go back to learning unit 1 and 2, those concepts now will be so much easier to explain.
So much easier. I mean, when they think of the graphs that they've now mastered, and when I think how some of them battled with the PPC, they've done so well, because I mean, now all of a sudden everything there, even learning unit 3 and 4 must seem so much easier to them than initially.
Exactly.
But thanks for being here and keeping me company, Joshua. I do appreciate it enormously. I'm going to stick around. You're welcome to as well a bit, just to see if there's anybody who wants to ask anything. I'm going to give it at least another few minutes.
And then stop the recording, please.
Yeah. In fact, I'll do that. I'll stop the recording now. Thanks for the reminder.
So it gets saved.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheers, Josh.
Thanks, Tammy. Bye, everyone.